All right, welcome everybody to the January 31st Gateway API Gamma meeting. As always, Kubernetes Code of Conduct rules are in effect, so please treat each other respectfully. And with that, we can I'll share my screen and we can get into our agenda for today. All right. So yeah, we can start off with a recap of last week's meeting. Mostly and of course, the recordings should be available on the YouTube channel if you wish to catch up on the full content. Yeah, so we mostly spent a lot of time talking about API review needs for the Gateway API 070 release. We do not have a specific date for that yet. I know that Rob was proposing something in like the 1 to 2 month range from now. So that is kind of like a rough goal to keep in mind. And this will be the first Gateway API release in which Gamma will go through like the actual formal API review process. In the 060 release, Gamma had an informational only kind of like a light review. But yeah, we should definitely expect feedback and potential changes from SIG network reviewers as part of this review. And yeah, so kind of before we get to that and are able to submit for that, we have a handful of issues that we already know that we want to kind of wrap up and tie up loose ends. We're tracking them in this milestone. And we removed one that was related to policy attachment, and we closed out 2 with one of the PRs that we finally got approval, and I guess I finally got around to giving a final LGTM on. So yeah, that John's PR merged, and that closed out a few of these. So we have really 2 things left to kind of clarify. Is we're on conformance testing. We want to develop a test plan for that. And there was a link to a similar test plan that SIG Multicluster had written up for some of their intentions on moving forward with conformance tests. So we don't necessarily have to have a full suite of tests and a framework written, but we should at least have a documented plan of how we intend to proceed with that. So that is one goal. And the other one is just clarifying how gateways should or should not interact with Gamma routing configuration. There's a pending GEP for that I authored a few months ago, and we should probably revisit. And it probably ends up being a thing that does not need to be a full GEP and should just be like a 1-paragraph PR to the existing GEP. So that was one of the other topics. Is we're trying to just really consolidate the bulk of the Gamma proposal into the existing GEP 1426, rather than trying any substantial new page on the website or spreading it across several GEPs or anything like that, just to make it easier for API reviewers. Yeah, okay, so that gets through that. And so this is a link to the exposing mesh services through gateways. That's the GEP that we'll probably need to revisit. And this is just another thing we discussed last week, was the Gateway API TLS use cases doc. It's something that started in the regular gateway or the main Gateway API meeting, focused on TLS route and other like re-encrypt or upgrade type use cases. It may be worth folks taking a look at from the perspective of mesh. even if it's just to explicitly state what we do and don't want to do, to make sure that, well, I know we've captured prior discussions around trying to keep like MTLS from service to service outside of the Gamma spec, to allow room for things like WireGuard implementations, or just reducing the amount of user facing configuration that's actually necessary. That's something that could easily be just a stated expectation without exposing it to end users to need to configure.
Has anybody heard of a situation where people think they would need to configure it or control it, basically where that assumption would not be valid? I have not heard of any. I just am curious if anybody else has.
I think
I guess that's a no.
the one that is like related, that's like Gamma relevant for TLS use cases, is like the application, like direct access to an application like outside of mesh use cases. There's something like that. I forget if it's in the stock or not. I know it's something that John's brought up previously, but not the like mesh service to mesh service case.
Yeah.
All right, and yeah, so that is most of what we spent last time discussing, and yeah, wanted to give a brief update on what got merged yesterday. So this was a very significant long-lived PR. I know John put a lot of work into it, and we had really helpful, thoughtful feedback from several different implementations. I really appreciated the comments from Linkerd folks, Matei and Flynn, and as well as Michael Beaumont from Kuma, who kind of like weighed in on this. So yeah, it's a substantial expansion of the Gamma scope to do a few things, including adding support for consumer-defined routes. It also kind of relaxes and removes some of the restrictions that I originally had in the initial get. So it allows multiple routes targeting the same service parent ref. So that allows you to split configuration and then have those routes follow the standard merging rules that already exist, are already well defined in Gateway API. And it also allows cross namespace backend refs, explicitly stating that that should be handled and secured through like mesh off the, sorry, I was blank. I had like the console specific term in my mind, but like mesh off the functionality rather than using something like reference grant. This also had a smaller PR merge into it. So this merged into the gap at the same time. Despite the closed label here, it merged into the other one and is now included in the full GEP. So this expands the scope to include non-HTTP types, so allowing TCP route, gRPC route, etc., in as part of the Gamma spec scope. All right, so that's a lot. I'll pause here. What questions, comments, or other things do folks have at this point? I'll stop talking for a minute.
Oh, I figured we would just be done after the review. That was a lot of stuff.
There is a lot.
I've got a couple of thoughts. So one, happy to see those PRs get merged in. I think that we've gotten to the point where the original design is not implementable for a couple of different implementations. So that's a milestone I'm pretty happy with. When it comes to kind of the remaining work, and Mike had that pulled up on the milestone board, we only have 3 outstanding items. 2 of them don't have owners. I'm owning one of them. One of the things I wanted to chat through was on the one that I'm owning, actually. So as far as determine or create a framework for mesh tests, support testing mesh implementations. I don't know if that is in scope for implementable for this initial sprint.
You broke
others'
up a little bit
opinions
in there,
here.
Keith. I'm sorry. You were
geez.
talking about the conformance one, the last one?
Yeah, the conformance one. I'm not sure that's in scope for like the implementable bar. Maybe I misunderstood something from our previous conversations here. But my understanding is that we needed a testing plan, but not necessarily the testing framework. So maybe the scope of the issue might need to be worded, but we might be reworded. But like when I read support testing mesh implementations, I'm thinking my brain goes to actual like framework for performance tests. Maybe the scope needs to be like dropped down, or another issue needs to be created. I'm curious others thoughts here.
I think we're on the same page in terms of like what we expect to deliver, but it probably is useful to make that more explicit, either in this issue or removing this issue from the milestone and adding another one. I also want to kind of double check with Shane on if that is acceptable for API review, to just have a conformance testing documented plan rather than the full framework in place.
Yeah, I think that's probably going to be fine to get started.
Just for the record, I
Cool.
would be okay with that. So
Okay,
I'm pretty
awesome.
hungry to
I'll
get
take-
something into Kuma in case that CFP goes through. So
which CFP was that, Shane?
I have a CFP with somebody from Google to do like a tandem Istio and Kuma doing like a gateway API from Ingress all the way through to Mesh. So like we would show HTTP route for Ingress and then HTTP route across the services
For KubeCon?
for KubeCon. And if they approve it, I'm going to be suddenly in a scramble to like actually get that working.
Conference driven development.
I don't know.
Best
I don't
kind.
know what you're talking about, Shane. There's nothing that I'm going to have to scramble for if the CFPs come through. Nothing at all.
Right,
And
right.
it certainly doesn't involve buying any hardware.
But even without that, I still think it's reasonable to say conformance tests are in place. We're going to kind of call that the next flag in the hill.
Yeah. Mike, can you flip back to the issues page there? You've been doing a ton of writing on this stuff. Do you want to assign the first one to me? I'll trade that one for
Sure.
maybe we can collaborate on the second one or something.
Yeah, I would be happy to assign to you.
Okay.
And there's a link to the GEP that I started that
Mhm.
has some content to pull from and update. And I know
Let
that
me,
there was at least one proposal there that suggests like removing host name from HTTP route. And that's something that we probably can't do at this point now that it's in beta. But if we still want to propose, we don't have to get into all the details, but yeah, let's think up offline about this. I would definitely appreciate.
I'm Kaflin on Google. Yeah. Okay. Evidently you knew that. On the conformance thing. Yeah, on the conformance thing, one of the, I'm sure I've said this before, but I don't remember how recently. One of the things that has long been a little frustrating for me about conformance on the Ingress side of the Gateway API is the sense that it was written for cluster providers and can be difficult to be conformant if you don't do the full dynamic infrastructure thing. And it would be really, really nice to have that be not such a constraint in Gamma. So,
Can you explain that a
but-
little more? Because I'm curious as a also
So-
not cluster provider implementation.
okay, so, and I'll rely on Shane to keep me honest here if I'm disparaging the Gateway API in any particular way. If you look
Oh,
at
boy.
the gate, if you look at the Gateway API and you look at the conformance tests, they have a strong expectation that the moment you create a gateway resource, then a bunch of things come into being in the cluster itself. And as such, it can be rather difficult to be conformant with Gateway API if you want to use a model where somebody, a developer, for example, installs an Ingress controller and then creates a gateway resource to configure it. The assumption is that creating the gateway resource effectively installs the Ingress controller.
Quite.
This is a frustrating thing in some cases. For example, with Envoy Gateway, it ends up introducing a fair amount of complication into some of these things. It would be really nice for Gamma if we could be conformant while at the same time supporting the use case, fully supporting the use case where your 4-person startup has somebody who just installs Linkerd and then throws a bunch of Gamma resources at it to configure it. Kostin, I think you're.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. Just going to suggest that it's a bug in the test suite if you cannot deploy the application gateway, whatever resources you need, and then run the test, then I suspect it's a bug in the test suite and we need to fix it. I completely agree with you that it should be possible.
It's a little unclear. And this may be something where, maybe, I don't know, Shane, maybe you've got a bunch of historical light to share here, right? I want to avoid being in that situation. If it is the case that that's an error in interpretation of Gateway API, then that would be really cool to know.
It's not an error, but there is more to be said. On a slightly pedantic note, you said in the cluster, and just to be clear, you can, whatever you provision can be extra cluster as well, if that has any bearing. The
Not,
idea,
yeah.
yeah, the idea that you have to provision something to kind of fulfill your gateway is definitely the lean of the Gateway API. However, the problem. Let me collect my thoughts for a second. There's 2 implementations I'm keenly aware of. They're not the only implementations, but Contour and Kong both have a previously conformant. I'm actually not sure. I haven't worked on that team in a bit, so I'm not sure of the exact conformance level today, but in 0.5.1 were conformant Gateway API implementations that allowed what's called a static mode, which is an existing gateway or a gateway that is otherwise provisioned then being reflected by a gateway resource. That does happen. It's not a super well documented or trodden path. So you're right, because it's not well documented or trodden path. There is a lean towards the opposite, but it is something that is done conformantly.
Is that is that static mode defined by the gate? How do I phrase this one? Is it that the documentation needs to be written, or is it, something that y'all?
I started
Okay.
a document some time ago for this exact purpose because I was working on implementing. At the time, I did work on the team that worked on that particular implementation and implemented the static mode. And we couldn't really agree on how to prescribe what people should do, because once you're in that mode, it's kind of really up to when you're provisioning a gateway, it gets a little bit more simpler to tell you some of the best practices, but for everybody's implementation where it's the gateway is just already existing or otherwise provisioned, it was really hard to come to agreement on what do you tell somebody how to implement that. The answer kind of turned out to be just make it conformant however you do that. So that's why it kind of sucks right now.
Yeah. John?
Yeah, I was going to say, if you look at the cloud providers, they clearly do this because you can set addresses on the gateway, but it's still hard to do that in the conformance test because you'd have to go set you'd have to go provision like, I don't know, 10 different things and then go set 10 different addresses on each of the gateways.
Mhm.
So like some other people mentioned, like Istio also supports that, like using the same address field. But I think there's kind of two things that come out of this to me is one, maybe the conformance test should have an easier way to configure those types of things.
Yeah.
But the other thing as well is it sounds like we all have methods of doing it kind of statically. I don't know if we're all doing it the same way. Like the cloud provider way is obvious, right? You provide a pointer to your IP address or name or whatever.
Mhm.
It's less obvious in cluster, I think. So we should maybe sync up and make sure we're all doing it the same way so that we have some consistency.
Yeah.
I was
And
gonna
just to be
say-
clear, lots of people are doing this. I just said contour and con because I know the code fairly well for these.
Yeah.
So I would definitely say an action item to take here would be create some kind of issue discussion, some kind of follow-up so that we can do exactly what John just suggested, because I think that's a
Yeah.
good point.
And I'd be-
Sorry, to interrupt. You mentioned that other vendors are doing this. Is any vendor that is not creating a service deployment with the name matching the gateway name? Is it something that we could just say, hey, by default, any resources should have the same name, just like?
It might be a good starting point. I don't actually know, but what I was trying to say there is I'd be happy to work with some other folks to try to nail some of that stuff down. But yeah, so that was the only thing that I had to point out about conformance right now.
Cool. That sounds good. I can take a closer look at our tests, but I know that we have an issue with some of the other tests in the suite that like spin up ad hoc resources and how that differs from like the resources that get spun up in the beginning of the suite. There's some issue where tests that need to spin up new resources within the scope of the test itself don't seem to work for us. But so yeah, that feels potentially relevant to this discussion too, as far as how conformance suite is provisioning things. So I can take a look at that and add any context there.
Yeah.
Cool. So yeah, sounds good. We'll create an issue. Shane will create an issue for follow-up on this. That we appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm gonna open a discussion.
Awesome.
Cool.
All right. We have one topic remaining, then I can open up the floor again. But just before, I wanted to bring to folks' attention that there was a discussion that started in Slack channel about egress use cases for Gateway API. I know that's something that many folks here probably have some interest in. It potentially overlaps with Gamma or mesh cases. It also potentially could be implemented as a standalone like egress gateway type implementation. So we probably want to have some degree of flexibility in how implementations are able to support it. But there should probably be a focus on defining a pattern that is implementable either with Gateway API and binding egress routes to a gateway, or through Gamma and binding something like the consumer routes that just merged, which are effectively a sort of egress type routing, depending on how that is implemented, whether it's at a sidecar enforcing it, or whether it's at like a namespace scoped egress proxy or something else. So yeah, there is a discussion that is scheduled for the main Gateway API meeting next week on Monday. So definitely would encourage folks to attend that if you're interested in that discussion. There's also a doc that someone started around egress use cases. It's some interesting context, particularly focused on kind of like the telco world and their use cases for it. And yeah, I think this is the like from and to and root references. This is an issue that branched out of comment on the namespace scope PR that just merged. But this is potentially relevant just in the context of a syntax that may be applicable to egress type things. It also might not. So yeah, just something to consider, and would definitely encourage anyone who has an interest in that to be part of that discussion or jump in the Slack thread. See if we can move that forward. I think just to clarify, we're not intending this to be in the scope of anything that's in an initial gamma release in 070, but it is one of the things that is on the up next kind of radar that it would not hurt to have folks start thinking about.
Sorry, were you saying there was already a Slack thread about the egress thing?
Yes, and it is linked in the notes here.
That makes too much sense. Never mind. I think I just found it. I'm gonna have to go read that doc before having.
Yeah,
anything intelligent
there's
to
a lot
say.
of content there. It's definitely an interesting read, and I think that there is a lot to think about. Egress is a large topic. We've touched on it a few times in the past, and I just wanted to raise it because I think that it's definitely relevant to the needs of many folks here. So
it's also really interesting in the sense of interacting a lot with the north-south side of the Gateway API as well.
yes.
So, yeah.
Well, that brings us to the end of our scheduled agenda. Is there anything else in folks' mind that we want to talk about during this time?
I'm really worried that Chris Pratt is gonna ruin Mario. I'm not feeling it.
I think we could just leave that as being really worried that that whole movie will be ruined without, I mean,
No,
I don't
Jack
know if
Black
it's
as
fair.
Bowser is awesome, but Chris Pratt as Mario is just bugging me.
well, I guess we're gonna have to
I'm
figure
not
out a way
I'm
to
not
tackle that.
sure what
in
I was
the Gateway
expecting.
API. Yeah.
I'm not sure what I was expecting, but that exceeds all my expectations.
Quick question: what happened with the re-encrypt slash whatever? I don't know what's called the proposal. Is it
Yeah.
progress?
That is in this Gateway API TLS use cases doc, and I believe is moving forward again in a smaller scope in the main Gateway API meeting. So it sounds like we're moving away from kind of the overly ambitious backend properties that attempted to set kind of like a template for doing a whole bunch of other things, and instead focus on just the narrow case of decrypt and re-encrypt or upgrade an unencrypted connection to the backend, and being able to specify that potentially through a custom filter or something like that. So yeah, discussion is happening. Yep, sorry.
Yeah, no, I'll read it. No, there is a discussion in Istio about customizing H2 settings. So you can max connections, max whatever, window sizes, whatever. And I was wondering if there is interest, if other vendors need to customize H2 settings, and where would that be in? Because there is client settings, server settings, sidecar to application settings, there are kind of places where they show up.
Is that something that would fall under like policy attachment things potentially?
It's perfect for policy attachment, but it's also very related with the TLS, with the array encrypt or whatever it's called. I mean, it's fine tuning, advanced enough that very few people know how to set it up properly, but also necessary. So I mean,
It's
if we have,
also-
yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Keith.
I think Costin was still had something he wanted to finish. Go ahead, Costin.
No, I'm done. Go ahead.
Okay. I'm about to go a different direction, so you go ahead, Flynn. Finish
There are a bunch of situations where I feel like trying to alter the TLS tuning or configuration for a connection a workload to workload connection inside the mesh. There are a lot of cases where I don't feel that a TLS route would be the way you'd want to do that anyway, because those workloads are not going to be speaking some random TLS protocol. They're speaking HTTP2, or they're doing gRPC, or something where a higher level route is the right thing to describe that. So that means that I lean a little bit more towards something that isn't a route, whether it's a backend property or a policy attachment, or insert meta resource discussion here. At the same time, I'm not going to lie, there are an awful lot of situations where I feel that your typical mesh user not only is not likely to be interested, but should not be messing with those parameters of that configuration. And so I'm kind of okay in a lot of ways with having it be something that's maybe there's a little bit of extra friction in that particular thing, messing with that particular thing. Keith, does that you still going in a different direction, or?
that's in the kind of the direction I want to take it as well. So that worked out well. I get the sense, and this is, but I feel as if there is, and people correct me if I'm wrong here, but I feel like there might be some hesitation towards using policy attachment for some of these extra things because it's an unknown. I feel like a lot of different implementations probably have resources or configuration settings that describe things like this that are like properties of a connection, TLS, all these kinds of things. And I agree with you, Flynn. I don't think that it feels like some of these things for the average mesh user aren't on the forefront of their minds, and it feels like it's better to keep those out of the main routing resources, and attach them to something else. Which again, there are a lot of things, as we've talked about policy attachment, that sound like policy attachment, but maybe it's something about the language of I haven't put my finger on it yet, but maybe it's something about the language of the GET. Maybe it's the example that was used, that is causing friction, even from myself, at seeing it as a viable option for some of these use cases. Maybe to the meta resource conversation, that's kind of happening on the Ingress side. Maybe there is another. Maybe what we're feeling is the absence of another resource to describe these things. Maybe it doesn't need the whole the overrides and defaults piece of the policy attachment get. But it does feel like there is a meta resource, like an invisible domain. What's the word I'm looking for? There is some entity that exists. Feels like there's some entity here that exists that we're reaching for that doesn't exist in the Gateway API yet. And maybe the solution to backend properties, TLS settings, any other use cases that have come up, like perhaps like egress or rerouting behavior, H2 settings, maybe that belongs in that meta resource. I don't know. Discuss. Maybe I'm not making sense.
Oh, it makes sense. Sorry. It makes sense. Console has a similar need for stuff like this. We don't go as deep into some of the stuff like window sizes, but we've expressed this in our current configuration model through a proxy default. So basically setting common values for all sidecar proxies, as opposed to service defaults, which is like specific configuration for a service where you likely want more of a developer focused use case of, I want my timeout, my retries, etc. Proxy defaults may be more common to connections common to sidecars that are tuned by a cluster operator, kind of like infrastructure DevOpsy type person, as opposed to an application developer. So I could see it being a different kind of meta resource, something attached to a mesh resource if we find a need to introduce that at some point. Yeah,
I was
I
actually
think it's
gonna,
also okay to just have it out of scope for now, and have it be mesh specific for now.
So in practical terms, I mean, right now I'm kind of trying to block the change in Istio to, until there is some understanding of what Gamma Gateway are doing. I mean, if it's completely out of scope, then I guess I'll just let them go through. Right now, people are using Envoy filter, and that's pretty brutal, not ideal. And again, the global proxy default, that's something that you don't want to put on all proxies. It's something that have a specific gateway or specific sidecar that receiving 10,000 WebSocket long lived. I mean, it's a different patterns as the usual, and the defaults don't match. Or we have very large buffers or high packet loss or whatever edge. So it's a clear use case, and people are using Envoy filters right now, and we need a solution. And that's then if other vendors have similar and we have some common way to express it, that's wonderful. Otherwise, I'll just move out of the way and let them do it. That was my.
I'm not gonna lie, the idea that a bunch of people are configuring Envoy filters in a service mesh scares the bejesus out of me. It just seems like here, have some rope. Would you like to hang yourself with it?
I think the worst thing is that which other people are proposing is to put everything that is in Envoy filters in the core API, and we have to support it for how many years?
Dear God, no! Please,
So,
no.
There's a balance.
And I mean, some of that is because I'm here as a representative of a mesh that doesn't use Envoy under the hood, and so trying to implement everything that an Envoy filter can possibly do is pretty much going to be a non-starter for us. It just doesn't make sense. But yeah, backing up to the idea that your typical mesh user that's far more likely to get people in trouble than it is to be of any real benefit in most cases. The other thing that I was going to point out was that somebody brought up timeouts, and I don't remember who that was. I apologize. But that's actually a great example of a thing where there are some things that we could certainly do them as a policy attachment or some other kind of a meta resource. And, you could absolutely make a meta resource of whatever kind that sets a timeout. On the other hand, that strikes me as an example of a case where that probably should not require a meta resource. You should probably just be able to do that in the route, because that's going to be really common. And it makes a lot of sense that people app developers should be able to do things like say, hey, I want to route here and I want a 3-second timeout. So figuring out a way to do things like that without a meta resource is something I am definitely very interested in. I think
That's a
that use
different use case. That's a very
Sorry,
different
say
use case. That's a very different use case. I mean, timeouts, everyone
Yeah.
needs them in common, but setting H2 timeouts, very, very few people understand how it is a
Yeah,
proper.
yeah.
Most
And I
people-
think that, you know, I'm calling that out because that distinction I think is really, really important. Yeah, Keith, it is. And one of the challenges with timeouts and one of the reasons why it's an example in policy attachment is trying to figure out a way to define timeouts that are common across implementers, you know, multiple implementers of the Gateway API, which I have not had bandwidth to go and do a bunch of research on that one, but I would love to find a way that we can start introducing timeouts as a specific example. I'd love to find a way where we can start doing that in a way that makes sense across all of the implementers, where you can say things like, okay, so we have a concept of a request timeout in the Gateway API as a standard structured piece of a route, for example, right? Yeah, it's on my list. My list is getting really long. But yeah, the things like H2 settings or, you know, that sort of thing. Yeah, I don't know. Things like TLS ciphers are a little bit more of a gray area to me, where most people probably don't need to mess with those, but it's a lot easier for me to imagine an application developer needing to mess with the TLS ciphers than it is to imagine an application developer needing to set esoteric H2 timeouts, for example, or configuration, for example.
Let's open and discuss it again next time and give people time to think about it.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just looking for, you know, some common, hey, more than one vendor is willing to put it as an attachment, policy attachment or some, then probably we should try to do the same in Istio. We'll see how it goes and provide feedback later. If there is zero interest, then we'll just go modify the existing Istio resources and be done with it.
As we all frantically type in the note stock.
Yeah, just catching up on this.
So I guess it's the short version, is the TLDR, that policy attachment is a little is too big of a approach for some of the things that folks are reaching for within the API, like timeouts being a really good example.
I think that's kind of always been the concern about policy attachment.
Yeah.
Like even for the discussions in north-south ingress cases, it's policy attachment appears to be a well-designed thing, but we have not had many implementations exercising it extensively yet. And there's definitely an appearance of we don't have a simple, straightforward pattern of this is how you do it. And these are examples of it done well in a way that is easy for users and users to configure. So I think there's definitely still some, like, that's why it's an experimental still. Is it needs a bit more proving out as a concept. We need to see more implementations trying to exercise it and kind of like figuring out if there might be a way to streamline it a bit. Yeah.
But not exercising is also an exercising, basically, negative way. So if nobody is using it and it doesn't have a lot of use, maybe it's something that needs to be rethought and you know, replaced with something that is more useful.
Keith, I think your point about CRD proliferation is a good one. The thing that concerns me with policy attachment is that not only do you end up with multiple CRD types, multiple CRDs floating around that have to be supported forever, to Thomas's point, But also in practice, you will probably end up with a large number of CRs. And there are a fair number of cases where, okay, just recently I did a thing where I was talking about Linkerd interacting with Ingress controllers. And one of the Ingress controllers I demoed was the Envoy gateway. And it took a few more CRs to get the Envoy gateway set up than I was initially expecting, because I chose to have my demo application in its own namespace. And so I instantly ran into cross namespace routing. And hey, guess what? I had to go and make sure that I had the right things in place for that, and stuff like that. So yeah, it's a thing. And yeah, Thomas, what CRD finalizers always work perfectly. Everybody knows that.
Everybody loves CRDs.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. We could have another fun conversation about versioning webhooks and things like that, right? Because those
Yeah,
are
I
always
think
work
that's
too.
probably, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was gonna say, yeah, I think the more I think through it, that's probably my biggest hesitation with embracing policy attachment, is that I'm having to commit to a new CRD, and all of the complexity that comes from adding a new CRD to a product. Like from the OSN side, we've got what's a semi-manageable number of CRDs, and we're even trying to start consolidating a couple. But depending on to Flynn's second point, the number of CRs that are being created in your cluster, things that you have to watch, it can create friction with users, because I'm just trying to configure a timeout, but not have to go and like create a custom resource and then think about this default and overwrite logic, but I might just want this timeout for this one location. Maybe you don't want the burden of a framework or something like that. So yeah, I'm not certain of the answer here. Even though I like the hierarchical nature of policy attachment, I think that's a really good way to solve certain problems. But I'm looking for something more lightweight for some of the policies, air quotes, policies or configurations that are missing in the routing resources right now.
If I'm reading correctly, it's almost a consensus that proliferation of CRDs and policy attachment may not be the most popular thing in this meeting, at least. And something like the backend policy or whatever it was called, with a bunch of optional fields that only some vendor supports, and that might be more palatable for a lot of people, or more kind of popular.
Something to explore, at least.
Something to explore, at least, yes, that's what I'm saying. That's why I asked at the beginning about the TLS setting and the other proposal, because I didn't like it with just TLS, re-encrypt, or whatever. But if we have all kind of odd things that otherwise will create CRDs per vendor, and maybe we have an easier way to agree on something.
I mean, I definitely do think it's worth emphasizing that, I don't think I have to really say this to this crowd, but just to be clear, obviously there are multiple implementations of the Gateway API, and so there's going to be a substantial amount of research that has to happen to make sure that anything that gets, anything we're proposing as an extension of a route is going to have something that is consistent across those implementations, right? And that's probably not going to be a small job, but that's probably okay. That would mean that we would be careful about things we're proposing adding to route CRDs. But yeah, there are a lot of things that I think policy attachment is going to end up being too heavyweight and too complex to be the only thing that we have lying around.
It's just worth a topic in the Monday Gateway API meetings to
What
bring
time
up.
is the
You think that-
the Gateway API meeting again?
Mondays at 3 p.m. Pacific.
Damn it.
Yeah, Eastern.
Yeah, it's late at
Uh,
night for me every week. It's not my favorite.
I attend while cooking dinner.
I'm gonna put it on my calendar and see if I can make it next week.
Yeah, it definitely does feel like something to bring up there. I know that Nick started thinking about meta resources in general and has written a doc that I can link at these notes at some point. And yeah, definitely merits further discussion in that group.
Yeah, I definitely think so.
All right, well, we're about out of time. So thanks for the discussion, everyone, today. Take
Thank you.
care and have a good rest of the day.
Take care.